And we're getting started. Terrific. So welcome. I am Hillary Goldman. I am the Executive Director of NAFIS, the National Association of Federally Impacted Schools. And welcome to our webinar on an update of the 2020 census. This webinar is an effort by NAFIS to continue to bring you programming that we would have held during the 2020 Spring Conference if the conference had not been canceled due to the coronavirus outbreak. The webinar is also timely because April 1st was the Census Day, so we think this is also great timing to share this information with you now. I'm glad you could join us today. We know people are very busy in their districts, and that's why we are recording this session today as well. But before we start the webinar, I wanted to take a moment to let you know about a new Twitter hashtag that NAFIS has launched. It's called #NAFISFamily. We're using that hashtag to highlight all of the great work that NAFIS members are undertaking at their school district in response to these uncertain times. And let me see if I can share my screen for a moment. And I'm going to show you, whoops. If you can see my screen, you can see some of the tweets that we've been following and retweeting. Not many places where a school bus is out in the countryside with their hotspot do you get a B2 flyover. That happened at Knob Noster in Missouri. We've been retweeting about all of the heroic efforts to feed students, support public health officials, overhaul your school districts basically overnight to provide distance learning to all of your students so that there's meaningful education continuing to take place. Here's some more pictures with school lunches and school meals. We've been seeing loads of school spirit weeks, loads of opportunities to show that school leaders are caring and connected with their students. And then here's some other examples where nurses and school districts are using 3D printers to support and manufacture some of the needs for PPE and masks and other things. Also want to give you a quick reminder about our 2020 Fall Conference, September 21 to 23. We still have that scheduled. So let me get out of the sharing. And let me go back to introducing our speakers. So Jocelyn Bissonnette is the director of the Funders Census Initiative at the Funders Committee for Civic Participation, though many of you, of course, may remember her as a staffer at NAFIS. And I think Jocelyn's only working in jobs that have long names in their organizational titles. So today, Jocelyn's going to discuss with us the connection between the census data and education, funding, that's the census data and education funding, available resources for educational professionals, and the importance of community engagement to ensure a fair and accurate count. We want everybody to be counted. We'll have an opportunity to ask questions, so please use the chat, or at the end of the session, feel free to unmute yourself and you can ask questions. So Jocelyn, welcome. We're glad you can be here. And again, just a reminder to all participants that we are recording this session so that you can review it, but also that you can share it with other people at your district. So Jocelyn, take it away.
Great, thanks so much, Hillary. It's really wonderful to be back with the NAFIS family. I hope you all are staying safe. I've had the pleasure of viewing all of the ways that you are continuing to engage and support your communities on the NAFIS Facebook page, and just the flexibility and resiliency of organizations and leaders during this uncertain time has been really inspiring. I know in the NAFIS community, organizations that I work with in my position. So I'm really thrilled to be talking about the 2020 census today. As Hillary mentioned, it's a very timely topic. But before I jump in, just wanted to say a little bit about my organization. It's a national organization that is a network of national, state, and community-based foundations that invest in organizations that are working to make our democracy more open and equitable. And so my work directing the Funders Census Initiative is to educate and mobilize foundations to participate, convene, and invest towards a fair and accurate census with a focus on communities that have been historically undercounted. And the joke that only you will understand is that I went from working on one program where it's all about trying to get people to complete a form to another. And just like the impact data application is going digital, the census is going digital for the first time this decade as well. So let's jump right in. If we could advance to the next slide. Great. So most of us know that the decennial census is a constitutional requirement. It states really clearly in Article 1 of the Constitution that we have to conduct a complete population count once a decade. And that means a count of every single person that is living in the country, regardless of age or race or immigration status. But what we often don't think about is what's at stake when we don't participate in the census. I'll talk a bit on the next slide about more specifically what that means. But when we don't participate in the census, it doesn't just impact what happens today or tomorrow or next week or next year. It has an impact on our communities and our states and our country for a decade. Next slide. So at my organization, an easy way to think about this is the 3 Ds, the data, the dollars, and the districts in terms of what census data mean. So for the data, the census is the statistical backbone of our society. It tells us who we are and how we're changing. It guides public, private, and nonprofit decision-making and is really important for advocacy work. In terms of the dollars, $1.5 trillion per year that's distributed to state and localities is informed by the census. That includes funding for services for young kids, for healthcare, for transportation, for the environment. So much of the distribution of funding depends on making sure that we get an accurate population count in the census. And then finally, the districts. The population totals that we get from the census inform not only the distribution of political representation for the U.S. House of Representatives, but all the way down to state elected officials and to school board districts. And it's also used to be able to monitor and implement and enforce civil rights laws. So regardless of what policy you care about, you need accurate census data. And so for the education community, making sure that we have a fair and accurate count is critically important to all of the work that you do. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a few slides. Next slide. But one thing that is really important to recognize about the census is that it's not equal opportunity. Every individual and community in this country doesn't have the same likelihood that there's not the same likelihood that they will participate. So you can see on this slide here, there are a number of categories that tend to be overcounted or double counted in the census. So people that have 2 homes, for example, they may be counted in both of their residences. It's often a proxy for higher income. And then you can see the categories that are historically undercounted in the census. Communities of color, particularly American Indians living on reservations, that was the highest undercounted race or ethnic category in the 2010 census. The highest undercounted age category in the 2010 census was young children, 0 to 4. And you can see immigrant communities, households with limited English proficiency, and renters. One other thing to note here is that military children are also at risk, in part because of their frequent moves. And I'll talk a little bit about the residency requirements for military personnel a little bit later. A little bit later in the presentation. And just a couple of statistics to put this in perspective. The 2010 census missed more than 3.7 million African Americans and more than 3.8 million Hispanics. And the 2010 census was the most accurate census that has been conducted in modern times. And so that just puts really what's at stake in making sure that we do our best to count everybody into perspective. Next slide, please. So the next couple of slides dig into the undercount of young children a little bit more. As I mentioned, you can see from this slide really clearly that children 0 to 4 were the highest undercounted age category in the 2010 census by far. And you can see that the next highest undercounted age category is children that are 5 to 9. Next slide. And again, this issue is an equal opportunity. So young children of color are much more likely to be undercounted in the census than for white children. Next slide. And even as we have gotten better at counting the total population more accurately over time, we haven't done a good job at keeping up that same rate for counting young children. So you can see that since 1950, the undercount of young children has actually gotten significantly worse. Next slide. And so what's at stake? This really reinforces the 3 Ds, but making sure that we accurately count young children means more accurate political representation. It means more funding so that we can do the important work of serving children and their families. And more equitable distribution of funds, including Title I, special education, Head Start, and others. Better planning, right? We know that data are really important for us to make really good informed decisions, whether that's a national policy decision or a local school board decision about what the planning for the school district is going to look like over the next 10 years. Next slide. So this slide is a little bit technical, so I'm not going to read every word, but I did want to include an overview of this information. There's also a link to this information, and the slide deck will be available with the recording that just walks through the residency requirements for children that are part of military families. And the basic residency rule is that where you live and sleep, where you live and sleep as of April 1 is where you should be counted. But there are some refinements based on families who are living overseas with a deployed service member. And so I wanted to make sure that you had access to this information so you can help your communities understand where and how they should be counted. And one last piece here on the young child undercount. Most adults are missed because they don't return the form. Most kids are missed in families that return the form but leave young children off. And so the same reasons and categories that we see for the undercount for the population generally, we think are also true, or we believe are also true for young kids whose families serve in the military. They may be renters, they move frequently, they may live in complex households, they may be splitting their time between 2 households. And so it's really important that we recognize this is a unique population. We want to make sure that we can get an accurate count of military kids along with all other kids. Next slide. So there are some challenges that are unique to every census. We always deal with apathy, with confusion, with fear, with mistrust in government. These are all barriers that make the decennial census, which is the federal government's largest peacetime activity, a massive multi-billion-dollar, multi-year undertaking. However, there are some challenges, barriers to a complete count that are unique to the 2020 census cycle. One of them is that the census is going digital. So for the first time, the majority of the population will be prompted to respond and complete the census online. You can also complete the census over the phone or through a paper questionnaire, but a majority of the population will be prompted to complete the census online, which has really brought to the forefront the inequity in terms of the digital divide. We also know, oops, sorry. Have you go back one slide? Thank you. So the key years of census planning happened sort of during the years of federal budget tightening and sequestration, as you all well know, and that really impacted the Census Bureau's ability to plan. So there's a reduced number of field staff, reduced communication staff, and that resulted in the cancellation of planned activities that would have allowed the Census Bureau to better plan. And one example of that is there were supposed to be 3 dress rehearsals where the Census Bureau was going to deploy operations as if it were in real time to be able to inform refinements of that operation. The planned tests were in Providence, Rhode Island, rural Appalachia, and on Indian Reservation in Washington State. The Census Bureau only had sufficient funding and only moved forward with the Providence test, which meant that they didn't have the additional information that would have been critical to their planning for rural areas and tribal areas. And that's just one of many, many examples of where the Census Bureau had to cut back because of reduced federal operations. And the last barrier that's particular to this cycle is community reluctance. Again, this is something that we always face, but given particularly the anti-immigrant rhetoric of this administration has stoked a level of fear that is unique to this particular cycle and has made it a real challenge to encourage immigrant households, mixed status households to feel comfortable responding to the census, even though census data is protected by the most stringent confidentiality laws that are in place across the federal government. Next slide. So this is a bit of a timeline to sort of bring us up to speed on where we are in this moment. Hopefully you've completed your census form already and you're encouraging your family and friends and your coworkers to do the same. You may have heard about the census on the radio or on TV or through a flyer at your local grocery store. We're in the thick of it. The majority of households were prompted mid-March through a letter in the mail to respond to the census online. Over the phone or through the paper questionnaire. The census actually started at the end of early January in remote Alaska with an in-person enumeration. But the majority of households were prompted to respond in mid-March. And as Hillary mentioned, last week was Census Reference Day, which was April 1. So you may have seen a lot of activity around that April 1 date. As of yesterday, 45.1% of households have responded to the census. So we're still pretty far behind where we were at this point in the cycle based on the 2010 rates. We've still got a long ways to go. And now that we have several weeks worth of data, we're beginning to understand where self-response rates are lagging. And unfortunately, we are seeing a discrepancy in terms of income, in terms of race, in terms of urban and rural. So we're concerned that communities that have been historically undercounted in the census are likely to be undercounted based on where the response rates are in this moment. And that is really reinforced by the disproportionate impact that we are seeing of the spread of the coronavirus, disproportionately impacting communities of color, low income communities. So we know that while the and if you can advance to the next slide, actually, we know that while public health and safety are the most important to prioritize in this moment, it has made our constitutional obligation to complete a fair and accurate census really challenging. The timeline really couldn't have been worse. And so organizations that have been steeped in census education, outreach, and mobilization for months and years are having to dramatically shift the way in which they do business, much like you as school leaders have had to do. And so right now, the census isn't front of mind. It's the health and safety of our families, our colleagues, our communities. In addition, the Census Bureau has had to delay some of its operations in order to comply with federal, state, and local health guidelines and best practices to keep both their employees and the health and safety of the community at the forefront. But this is how we think that, again, the impact of the virus and the shift in field operations is a big piece of the puzzle in explaining why we're so far behind where we were in 2010. We're particularly seeing this in very rural and tribal communities. While a majority of households receive a letter in the mail and they're asked to respond to the census online or over the phone, the way that the enumeration takes place in really rural and remote communities, including Indian country, is either an in-person enumeration called the Update Enumerate operation, or an in-person drop-off of materials, which is called the Update Leave operation. But because field operations have been suspended, those households haven't received a visit and they haven't received any information about the census. And so we're concerned about the ability and the accessibility of those households and communities to have a fair shot participating in the census. And so you can see here a number of other talking points that were developed by our national civil rights partners who are very steeped in the census work. Next slide. But as I mentioned at the beginning, we're also seeing incredible adaptability and flexibility and resiliency. And so many organizations who had planned in-person events, festivals, celebrations, questionnaire assistance kiosks, had planned to staff local libraries and other types of events are moving or adjusting their plans. And these are some of the innovative examples of education and outreach that we have seen communities transition to, again, in order to continue with fulfilling their mission to help make sure we get a fair and accurate count while keeping their communities safe. And so these are great examples that you and your communities can consider and integrate into the lesson planning, the communications, and outreach meal delivery that you may already be doing. Next slide. Again, the next two slides are pretty dense, so I'm not gonna read them. But this is messaging testing that was conducted by the National Congress of American Indians to help inform the development of their resources and their campaign to get a fair count in Indian country. And so I wanted to make sure that you had access to the information about what they found to be most resonant in talking to their constituency about census participation. And so you can see the top lines here are acknowledging and respecting the capabilities and accomplishments of Native people in the present day to connect on a personally relevant level, inspiring hope for the future that doesn't require compromising Native pride. And if we go to the next slide, we can see the other two key takeaways about what resonated as part of their focus groups and messaging testing research. Fostering positive patriotism, And then the last one, highlighting specific benefits that participation in the US Census has for Native communities. And there was messaging testing done by many organizations, again, to try and get a sense of what are the messages that are most resonant and motivating for people to respond to the census. And what you see out of the NCAI research has a lot of we see similar themes across messaging testing that has been done. So positive messages. Positive messages are much more resonant than negative messages. So talking about why this is important as opposed to talking about what a community might lose out on, and really highlighting the specific benefits to that community, whether it's funding for roads or bridges or hospitals and healthcare clinics. Particularly now, emphasizing how important accurate data are for healthcare planning and to make sure that communities are receiving their fair share of access to healthcare programs is really important, and we know really resonates with people. Last slide, please. And so I want to end on a positive note as well. First, to say that you don't have to start from scratch. There are a wealth of resources that are available for you to understand what is at stake with the census for your community in terms of federal funding, in terms of understanding how your state and community are doing in the count compared to 2010 and compared to other states, as well as resources to help think about curriculum, materials. And so I've shared a list of what I think are the most, what I think will be the most informative and relevant resources for the NAFIS family with the staff. And they'll be sharing those resources as a follow-up with you. And then lastly, you're the experts. You know your communities, you know what your communities need, you know how to communicate with your communities. And so really thinking about how you can just integrate and elevate the importance of participation in the census as a part of what you know how to do on your day-to-day will be incredibly helpful. The last piece of messaging testing research that I'll share that was common across all themes is that local school leaders are among the most trusted messengers in delivering messages about the importance of census participation. And so we need your voice, we need your platform in order to make sure that we get this right and that our communities are fairly counted and can access the data, the dollars, and the districts that are their fair share for the years and for the decade to come. So let me end there. Happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Jocelyn. We do have a few questions. So actually, one thing I was thinking of while you were speaking, with all of these students home and learning, and many schools sending devices home with students, that it would be interesting that this could be a homework or a homeschool activity with the parent to go online and complete the census form, and maybe to do another activity around what the census is. Be an interesting project for a family.
Yeah, that's exactly right. The only trusted messengers that sort of poll higher than local medical personnel and school leaders are families. And so many of the organizations, the National Education Association, the Count All Kids campaign, have developed a number of sort of curriculum, educational materials to help students educate their families and their households about how important it is to participate. And the Census Bureau itself also has really great examples for curriculum, coloring books, that sort of material that is all available publicly for free.
Great, thank you. So a couple questions. First, is there any possibility that deadlines will be extended?
That's a great question. It's a really great question and an important one. So as of today, the Census Bureau has already extended a number of operations. They put on hold a number of operations for the in-person enumeration, for example. There is an entire operation that is done to count people who are experiencing homelessness, count people that are who are transitory, so migrant workers, including people that live in group quarters, so college students, people who are in skilled nursing homes. That was also supposed to take place at the end of March and early April, and that has been delayed. There's a handy one-pager that I'm also happy to share that outlines the current set of dates. Although we are expecting the Census Bureau to announce either this week or next week an additional extension, just based on where we're seeing the shelter-in-place orders in various states that far extend beyond the current dates that the Census Bureau has published. People have until January 31st to respond to the census. That's already been pushed to August 15th. Again, we are expecting that that will be extended again. The Census Bureau has pretty broad authority to modify and delay these operations. Where their authority ends is that there are 2 statutory reporting deadlines. So the Census Bureau must provide the population totals to the president by December 31st, and the Census Bureau must provide the state population totals to the states for the purposes of redistricting by April 1st, 2021. So the point in time that the Census Bureau's delay in its operations would impact its ability to meet the statutory reporting deadlines, then it would require a change in the statute to significantly delay or postpone the census. And obviously that would require approval from both Congress and the president.
Mm-hmm. Wow, that would be a challenge possibility. Yeah. Then a couple more questions. One, just a clarification, when you were talking about Washington State and tribal lands and something that had gotten canceled, can you explain again what that was?
Yeah, so part of the Census Bureau is already working on the 2030 census. So it takes about 10 years to plan this. As I mentioned, it's the federal government's largest peacetime operation. They have to hire 500,000 staff. And so part of what is always built into their plan is a dress rehearsal. So they take a small population area and implement a full census there to be able to inform their is the content and the instructions, do those make sense? How to complete the census, does that make sense? Is their communications motivating and resonant with people? And so they had originally identified an urban area in Providence, Rhode Island, a rural area in Appalachia, and a tribal area in Washington State to complete those 3 dress rehearsals. And because of funding constraints from Congress, they were forced to cancel both the dress rehearsals in Appalachia and on the tribal lands in Washington State. And that should have taken place in like 2017, 2018.
Wow. And it sounds like the 2 that got canceled would have maybe been the more difficult to implement, right? And probably more expensive since they were probably a little bit more rural. One other question. At the beginning of your presentation, you talked about demographics of individuals that were undercounted. Where does the data come from? Like, how can one know that someone was undercounted if the census is the main thing for counting people?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the Census Bureau, even though the census happens once every 10 years, the Census Bureau conducts a number of other surveys from which we can gather statistics and understand where the country is and how it's changing in the interim years. And so a small sample of the population we see is what's called the American Community Survey, which is a much lengthier survey that provides additional demographic and geographic area that can help inform federal statistics and lots of other data and planning in the interim years. The Census Bureau can also surmise a lot through birth and death rates and through other administrative records that are collected from other government agencies. And finally, the census will conduct, starting late in the summer, what's called the post-enumeration survey, which is a sample of the census that helps the Census Bureau understand how accurate the census actually was. So there are a number of different statistical tools and surveys that the Census Bureau conducts to help it understand how well the decennial census went. And that's how we know that there was an undercount to, a pretty incredible level of detail.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, when I received my census application in the mail, or the form to complete, I didn't realize it was solely an online activity this time. And I was really surprised because there's a lot of people, not just people who maybe don't have access to internet, but you think about some elderly or just other individuals that might not really know how to get online to complete this, or some people who get their internet at the library and now the libraries are closed. So
the American. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, I was just saying it really seems like this has been set up in a way that's going to be very challenging to get a complete count.
Yeah, so you can respond. You can respond online. You can also respond over the phone. And if you were slated to initially be prompted to respond online but haven't, your fourth reminder, which will be going out, I think is going out now and will be arriving at households, actually does include a paper questionnaire. So much of the testing that has been done shows a strong preference for paper. And so even though it's much more expensive to do that, which is really what prompted the Census Bureau to develop an online option in the first place, it was basically a cost savings directive from Congress. They do include that paper form in the follow-up mailing because they understand that whether it's a comfort issue, whether it's an internet accessibility issue, or a language issue, whatever it might be, that there is that paper form. And there are some rural and remote areas that do receive, or that were supposed to have received, some did, some didn't, the paper questionnaire on the first mailing.
Right. Does anybody else have any questions to add to the chat, or if you'd like to unmute yourself? No other questions?
Yeah.
Oh, Paul?
Hillary?
Yeah.
Yeah, Jocelyn. The concern, I'm out in Washington State, and when you talked about Washington State and reservations, you landed right in my bailiwick here. I'm very, very concerned because right now our reservation is closed down because of positive virus situations on the reservation. You mentioned 2 dates, and I thought I heard January, and then it got extended to the end of August. What year are you talking? The end of August 2020 or 2021?
So the people can respond to the census originally through July 31st of this year. That's been extended to August 15th through this year. We expect that will be delayed again, but we're waiting on an announcement from the Census Bureau about what that new date will be. So the Census Bureau itself has the authority to push back that date only till the point in time that it would impact the first of 2 statutory reporting deadlines, the first of which is December 31st of this year. Which is the time by which it has to send the population totals to the president. So if the date keeps getting pushed back so that the Census Bureau itself wouldn't have time to process the data in time to meet that January 31st deadline, then it becomes a much more significant conversation around the timeline because it would require a change in the law.
Yeah, I get that. We're just in a quandary.
Yeah, I heard an update on sort of census outreach in Navajo last Friday, which was incredibly sobering. We know that a number of tribal leaders with the National Congress of American Indians and other Native-led organizations, this is front and center for them. They are in conversation with other national groups in the Census Bureau to push the Census Bureau to be as transparent as possible about what the suspension in operations means, what the contingency plans are, what their contingency plans mean, and for making sure that we get a fair and accurate count of Indian country. But as you note, it's a big challenge right now that is beyond just the census itself.
Yeah, it's hard enough to count that area, especially doing it digitally, maybe as a first try, and then add the coronavirus to it. It's really challenging.
Yeah.
Okay, anybody else have a question? Right, well then that concludes our webinar on the census. Jocelyn, thank you for joining us. And as I mentioned at the top of the session, we have recorded this. Hopefully it came out well enough that we will then be able to share with the entire NAFIS family, and also for those of you on the line already participating, you can share with your colleagues as well. So Jocelyn, thank you very much. And everybody, please stay safe, stay healthy. And we look forward to watching all the great things and seeing all the great things you're doing on social media, sharing them out to our broader community, and then also seeing you in person in September. So have a good afternoon, and thank you again, Jocelyn.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Stay safe.
Yep.
And wash your hands.